So potassium. So a few things I just wanted to talk about and maybe get a discussion on is just observing some, at least looking at soil tests, and I'll show some data in a minute of soil test K levels. You know, what does that mean? And a little bit about yield response. What do we really know about it? You know, from data, and how that might relate to plant health issues and possibly animal health issues. So, you know, when I moved to Vermont in 1990. So when I first came here from Pennsylvania, I think the prices for potash was, Tom, help me out, probably around 12. Well, this graph shows around 12 cents a pound for K2O, and that was about what it was here. This is a national trend, and it had been that way for a number of years, and it continued to be that. I mean, potash was cheaper than, you know, certainly nitrogen and phosphorus. And this you know, trend shows it pretty much stayed steady until what? 2003, 2005 is when it really took off. And if any of you, some of you folks are young in here, so you may not remember, but 2008, that was the real killer when these prices shot up. There was a big demand from China. And it really just was a wake-up call.
High commodity prices.
Yeah. Now things have settled down, and since then, but it certainly, I think, has made us think more about, especially for potash. Again, back in the old days, I think, except for certain animal problems, if you had too much, you know, it's more like insurance. I see some agreement here. I mean, you know, from both fertilizer dealers and from Extension. I mean, I don't, you know, it was cheap enough that we based it a lot of times on the removal rates, and we'll get into that a little. But certainly we've shifted that over the last probably 10 years. So
we're good.
Oh, that's right. This works. Okay. So this is a summary from the UVM Soil Test Lab that was sent to me last year. So it doesn't include this past cropping season, but I think it's around a 3-year average of soil test levels of various nutrients, our major nutrients, by county. So I thought it was interesting if we look at just potassium, this column of potassium, Washington, well, Windsor County, down this way, the average for K is around, what, 58 to 69 parts per million. Okay. Now that's the average, and we know how averages are. You can have one hand in cold water and one in hot, and on the average you're comfortable, right? But it's still a good number to look at. If we look at our recommendation guide of what we would classify as low, medium, optimum, or excessive levels, then we want a K of about 100 to 100, really 100 to 160 is optimum for typically for yield.
And these differences are, tell me if you think I'm wrong, but largely due to the parent material, the actual.
Well, I was going to ask the group that, Dan. So what's your reaction? What's your reaction to this tape? First off, are these numbers typically what you see on your farm?
I see a lot of low numbers in our, you know, this side of the state.
Yeah. Did we always see? Now, this is my question. This is my question for you, Tom, because you've been over on this side of the state a long time. Even back in the days when we might have been, you know, price wasn't such a constraint. Has it always been a challenge maintaining K levels?
That's a loaded question, because really what I find, and it depends on if you're looking at grass fields or corn fields, and it can depend on our application rates, but it can also depend on the grain company that is going to service them the farm.
Yeah.
Okay, because I find differences in potassium levels and manure.
Oh yeah.
Based on who they buy the grain.
Okay. No. Right. So it's very, very. quite very, yeah. But I agree with you. I mean, look at Addison County,
Yeah.
mainly clay soil. So it's got a lot. It always has a lot of protection. Even though I've seen Addison County clays that actually were potassium deficient because they've been mined out over the years. I have Kevin. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, these are all pH 7 extraction that you're doing ammonium acetate. Because that's what they do for a soil test. And then,
Yeah.
And then if you go down to pH 4.8, which I think they used to do, just to see what some of the reserve was. And some of these soils over here are acid. And then the further you go down into the soil horizon, the higher the pH. So there may actually be some soils that indicate a potassium deficiency, but there may be enough actual potassium for equilibrium.
Right. Well, and so I'll show you some data from New York that gets to that. So that's a good discussion point. Okay. So so that is a question: is that really low or not?
Well, the other part of it is a lot of people who put it on, whether it's wood ash or potash, they see a response, a yield response to it. So that, at least on this side of the state.
Yeah, and really when I come back to grass and corn, because a lot of times on grass field, people think nitrogen, and so they put it on urea and not put it on any
Right.
So.
And we know there's an interaction. Absolutely.
Well, and it's, I mean, the other thing is you'll get more clover and things like that when you correct that potassium issue.
Right.
Whether there's a huge yield thing is still debatable, right?
Right. So just to pull from summaries to just an individual, I pulled from a recent soil test. I blacked out the names, but it is from Wyndham County. Somebody in here might recognize it. And again, just a low for phosphorus as well, and potassium. So I just thought,
Yes.
You can bring it on in, absolutely. Okay. So this soil test, and again, it may vary depending on what lab you use, but if we're at this level for potassium, so numerically that's 34 parts per million. Again, 100 to 160 would be an optimum range. That's what we're shooting for maintaining it at. So this one, I don't show it, it's below this, but it's recommending 180 pounds of K2 per acre. Would be generally, if we're that low, we're going to be recommending.
Actually, I see a lot of those numbers, and 180 plus. Do you see a lot of those too? Yeah.
So how many times, and this is for everybody in here, but it's great to have several of you here that visit a lot of farms. How many times have you seen the extreme of potassium deficiencies?
I don't see it in forages except maybe as disease symptoms. The grass has more rust maybe than otherwise would, but I don't see the actual clinical deficiencies.
Kevin,
I don't see much soybean, but I've seen it in corn. And some clovers.
Yeah, you see some. Sometimes it's hard to tell even with the clovers what exactly is this, because it could be that, it could be boron.
Well, alfalfas and even red clover I've seen has that very distinct, those little round spots near the edges, which is pretty clear. Yeah. I've only come across corn, at that extreme a couple times, and one of them was an interesting one where, and this was in Addison County, on not too heavy of a clay soil, but the field was several miles away from the home farm, so he didn't get manure on that field, just relied on starter fertilizer. Over time, it was just got too low, and it was showing up early in the season. I
think some of the fields that are neglected too, you can have several things going on at the same time, so it could be boron and potassium.
Oh, absolutely.
It's like, what is it? It doesn't perfectly match any one thing.
Not normally, yeah. In that particular case, I said, well, it's early enough. You might be able to side dress and try it. It's not going to hurt you getting it back in the soil.
Right.
If it doesn't help this year, at least you're good. And he actually did. It did because he did a little bit of, left some untreated. It did make a difference. So again, we can draw it down pretty quickly, right? Alfalfa can remove a lot of potash. I usually use 50 pounds as my rule of average when I'm calculating, but we know it can, if you just take the percent K times the yield and adjust K to K2O, we can get up to 70 pounds removal pretty easily. But here's the issue, even if it will grow at a lower level, where's that level for disease resistance, winter hardiness, resistance? Those are issues as well, and maybe even bigger issues. So some to think about. Grasses can remove just about as much. If they're high yielding grasses cut early with a lot of nitrogen applied, that can really draw down potassium. But here's an issue too. If we get down to too low a level, even if it supports yield for grasses, you might start changing if you want to maintain some legume in there, you got to have at least a certain amount of potassium. Because those grasses are much more competitive for for that lower level of K than legumes are. And they extract, fibrous root's going to extract the K a lot more readily than legumes will. So back to this, if our soil test levels are, less than optimum, it's not always hard to see yield differences. But how much do we pay? What kind of return are we going to get? So anybody, what's the price of potash going on?
Potash is going to run yet between 20 and 25 cents per pound.
Is that what it's running right now?
It's about half of it. It was not too long ago.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
per ton, you're talking between 400 and 400.
Yeah, that's okay.
And that's lower than it's been.
Yeah, it's been dropping. Yeah, and it doesn't always necessarily correspond with fuel prices like nitrogen, but there's some. So now's the time to really look at it to build it back up. But I was doing some calculations at 400 pounds, and you're at low and you need to add 180 to 200 pounds, and you'd need to see a ton of haylage yield or half a ton of dry matter yield probably to recoup that cost on an annual basis. So, when I look at for data where there's been studies done, response data, there's not a lot out there. So I'll just share a little bit. We haven't done any actual trials in a long time looking at, yield studies, replicated trials. This was one done many years ago. I've probably shown this data at meetings because it's old data. I'm sure I've shown this in the past. So this was a study done up in Franklin County. The soil was I think it was a Georgia stony loam, kind of, a silt loam, stony loam soil. Its original soil test level was optimum for phosphorus, but medium, again, probably at that medium range for potassium. And this was just a very simple study. It was not a response rate study. Basically, we put on annual applications of 60 pounds of P2O5 and 180 of K2O, kind of those recommended levels based on the soil test for K. And the treatments were either, this is the control, nothing was applied. This was already an established stand of alfalfa grass, I think seeded the year before. And so that was our control. And then the red is just potassium only, and the white is potassium and phosphorus. And over this 3-year period, yields were, I think that was just a reflection of, it just looks like a trend, but I think it was just better weather and better growing conditions. Generally, you see a decline in yield with alfalfa over time. Of course, this was an alfalfa grass mix, so I think this was more weather related. But just within years, the only, I don't think this was significant, but this was, and this year it was, about a half a ton more. But it was always the K only, the phosphorus really didn't add anything. So I think it was clearly a potassium response. So we got about a half a ton yield increase off of that 180 pounds, which again, if you look at prices, would probably break even. It's not going to make you a big profit, but at least it's covering its cost just from yield alone, much less reducing the risk of winter injury and those kinds of, a little more, I call them intangibles.
Well, plus it's nice to have the inventory if you can get it. I mean, that's worth more than just the commodity value.
Exactly. Yeah. But I don't know if you've seen, this came out a few years ago, but this is more recent, some research done at Cornell, and I thought it was interesting data, so I wanted to share this and maybe get some discussions about it. This was a study and I think this was a reaction to those high prices in 2008. My guess is they had this long-term corn trial going, comparing different manure and compost, and that trial was ending, so they imposed this alfalfa trial afterwards. Because what they did was, this field was in corn for 5 years, and they had these fertility treatments. One was just inorganic fertilizer, nitrogen-based. They had a treatment of manure that was applied at a rate that satisfied the phosphorus needs, and then they supplemented with chemical nitrogen. They had a compost that was similar as far as meeting the P needs of the corn. Another treatment was manure meeting the nitrogen needs, and I know that was like 20,000 gallons of liquid manure in that. I remember that number. I don't have all the figures here. These were annual applications to feed the corn. I just want to stress that. And then a compost that was meeting the nitrogen need. That must have been a lot of compost. We've done those studies. And in fact, trying to estimate what actually is available to the crop is not easy with compost. I do not remember, and I apologize, the actual figure. But my point here is these treatments were added each year in the corn. Then the corn was tilled in and planted alfalfa. Nothing was added in the next 5 years to the alfalfa. They just measured yields off these stands. So this is the yield of the alfalfa. It was seeded in 2006. I think this was just a poor crop yield. I think it was a dry year. And the only, you can see what happened. So really, they found that even after 5 years, they were getting excellent yields from carryover from these manure crops. Okay, not totally surprising, but still, I think they were just trying to see, can you bank your potassium while you're in your corn rotation? And they estimated, this was Corinne Curians, their soil specialist. She estimated that with the manure treatment that meets a nitrogen need, so at that higher rate, they were building up at a rate of about 25 pounds of K2O per year, banking it, getting over this 5-year corn rotation. Where with the manure based on P, it was more like 10 pounds, about half is the amount. But certainly they were running short, but look, it took a while. But they were running short at the lower manure rates compared to the high rate. If you, I guess I can use this. Now this is a very busy slide, so I'll just focus. This is the actual soil test measurements of all these treatments in the in this alfalfa portion of it. So in 2006, that's the soil test of all those different corn manure treatments. And certainly it makes sense that there was a big buildup with the high compost and the high manure treatment. So going into this, but interestingly, they measured spring, fall, all the way up through 2010. That didn't draw down as quickly as you think. Now again, Tom, you made a good point. It depends on the soil type, the manure history, organic matter of that soil. And for this particular soil, I think they showed that it had a lot of residual effect. So it really does depend. And then you made a point, Kevin, about maybe depth. So something else to think about here. Because I'll show, in order to see if these levels were actually optimum for yield, they added another study to this trial. These were strip trials. Within the strips that were the control strips, they did a study where they imposed a rate response trial of adding fertilizer K to this, and they didn't start that until I think 2007, and they added these rates of potassium from 0 up to 335. This 252 pounds of K2O per acre was estimated to be balanced with removal rate. That was kind of their removal rate recommendation. And so a couple things to look at here. This is the yield of these treatments. Keep in mind, this was not applied until spring of 2007, after the first cut, I think, or just maybe when the alfalfa was starting to green up. So no, you wouldn't expect a difference here because there was nothing different. But out of all these years, only in 2008 was there a yield response to those rates. And this was applied on the strip that had not received any manure the previous 5 years when it was in corn. Okay. So, and according to Corinne, this was an exceptionally good growing year. Obviously, I mean, you look at the yield differences. And that kind of accentuated or exacerbated the differences in the treatments, I think, and really showed a yield response. But otherwise, they weren't getting it. And I wonder, and she didn't allude to it, but I wondered about below the soil tests. What's going on below that for this particular kind of soil? Because when they looked at their actual soil test levels, which was here, again, the fertilizer treatments were applied after this one, so no difference here. I don't know what's going on here, but you start seeing differences because you are adding quite a bit of difference in potash. This is Cornell uses a Morgan soil test. We use a modified, but I don't think the K extraction is much different in those two tests. But keep in mind, they report in pounds per acre. We report in parts per million. So how do you convert that? You divide by 2. So our soil test where this would be 100, that would be 50 with a UVM test, 50 parts per million. But it was interesting, they didn't pick up
the yield response
except that 1 year.
That's one of the reasons why when somebody has something going on in their field and you see these soil tests, I always encourage people, try something on just a small, don't go through a whole bunch of something out there. You want to figure out what the actual problem is, where we're going to get a response rather than wasting a bunch of money on, addressing something that's not actually causing a yield problem. So I guess that's what you can take from this is you might have a low soil potassium test, but that doesn't mean that you should spend a whole load of money until you see a response from it on a small scale.
Right. And, I think in your crop rotation planning,
Right.
thinking about your manure resources to bait
Keep
that
up, yeah.
is a good way to think about utilizing that. So yeah, so kind of a take home, certainly soil testing is our best tool, I think, still. And probably for, trying to get that test the year before it goes into a seeding would give us time to really make some decisions. And then probably somewhere third, fourth year in is another good time to see, depending again on the soil type, whether it's being driven down quickly or not, would be another good time. You mentioned it, and I threw it in there too. If coming out of the corn rotation, again, the manure history might have a big impact. So maybe leave a test strip of unapplied area just to see. Sometimes it's hard to see and measure a yield difference, but oftentimes we can see it just in crop height and crop growth. I always, we'll do that for nitrogen, but I never think about it for potassium, but it might not be a bad idea.
What your last point there, using your tissue test, when Sid and I had an email interaction about a soil in North Danville a few years ago, where they had super high potassium in their forages, but their soil tests were not necessarily high. In some cases, they were low, and so that's a good point. Yeah.
So tissue testing, or even just monitoring, kind of keeping an eye on the forage test for K levels, might give you some clues of where that management is. I think it can be tricky though, because just the stage of maturity is going to influence the K level.
And also the mineralization over winter. It's first cut is always going to be high.
Right. So back to the old thing about potassium, if we look at that relationship between soil test level and growth, ideally, if our soil test recommendations are correct and our measurements if we're at that low range, between low and optimum, this is where we should see a yield response. If things are right. Hi, Sue, come on in. So this is yield, this blue line. The red line would be the amount of K in the plant. So your potassium content. And I'd say, I don't know if I'm showing it linear. As your soil test level goes up, you're increasing in K, right? All right. So if your optimum yield is right here, 95% of relative yield, then your optimum K level content should be right here, okay? And for alfalfa, that's usually been touted as somewhere between 2 and 2.5%, or 2 to 2.2% K on a dry matter basis, okay? And we know, any of that excess K is just luxury consumption. The plant's taken up a lot more than it really needs for growth and yield. And probably, and here's where it gets sticky, probably even a little bit, what I don't know, Dan, I don't know if you come across any, or Kevin, or Tom, or anybody else, do you get any additional disease protection when it's a little lighter? I don't know. Have any evidence of it, or I don't know. But
well, I don't know. Just anecdotally, usually when you have a bunch of the classic pictures, when you have a lot more manure in one spot than another, it's tough to sort out what's the nitrogen, what's the potassium.
Right.
There's a good example in Marshfield where a farmer had planted some Italian ryegrass. And Italian ryegrass can have a crown rust problem anyway, especially if it's genetically more susceptible. There are some pretty good resistant varieties. But in that field where a lot of these susceptible varieties had been planted, it's an organic field, so they can't hammer it with nutrients from synthetic sources. They relied entirely on manure, and they were still getting those fertility levels up. So anywhere in the field, you saw those great fertility blotches with great Italian ryegrass growth. There's very little crown rust,
right?
And probably had something to do with potassium, whether it was luxury or not. You don't know. I guess you can, at that.
And rust is associated with nitrogen too. So.
Right. So I think testing those, you can maybe, if you
Yeah.
tested those tissues, you might be able to figure that out.
So I'm going to skip that one. So looking at K levels again, I think alfalfa 2% has been the rule of thumb, even though after that study Corinne Ketterings did at Cornell, she's like wondering if it could be less than that to be a critical value for yield. For grasses, it's a little harder to find literature on it, but here's a couple of recommendations that I came across. This was out of some work done back in the 90s, showing, for cool season grasses, 1.2 to 1.5% would be critical. A little higher. Again, similar to alfalfa, 1.6 to 2.5 would be adequate. Again, adequate if you're going to have adequate yields. Anything over that's really excessive or high. Jerry Cherney out of Cornell kind of uses this guideline of if it's a moderately managed grass, let's say you're managing these grass for close-up diet for dry, for your dry cows, where it might be 2 cuts a year. That spring growth might be around 1.5. Regrowth usually is going to be a little lower, so it might be 1.2%. Okay, would be critical for yield under that situation. But certainly, if we're going for high quality multi-cut, 4 cuts a year, then again, it's probably going to be about 2 to 2.5% would be a number to shoot for.
Why does it go up so much into 3 to 4 cuts a year?
Well, so here's where is this, can we use this as a guide to know we're at an optimum level for yield, or is this a reflection of the maturity of the grass you're cutting? I think it's higher because you're cutting, earlier. Okay, but I think it's also been a reflection of if you're using, let's say, looking at your forage tests, and you've got high quality haylage and it's running 1 to 1.5% K, then you might also then look at your soil test, see if you're running low, because you could run out of steam pretty quickly. So anyway, just some thoughts and guidelines of monitoring not just soil tests but also your.
Was there any mention of that in the Cornell studies?
Not that I saw of from their studies. I know our own recommendation is you have to get pretty, if you have, I think it's over 200 parts per million of K, if your soil test is really high in K, and then you really need to watch your magnesium. If your magnesium's even at, let's say, possibly balanced. But if you looked at those average soil test levels across by county, magnesium was always in the optimum. The average was within the optimum range. We do have a few soils where you get some, really high magnesiums. But it can be an issue when you're at those extremes, I think. What's been your experience?
Not much, but I, tried to recall some of the things I've read, and it seems you probably want a certain balance between all the cations.
Well, there's the debate about about the cation and not decad. That's a different story. Yeah. But this balance of cations, and I think it's really a level of degree.
Yeah.
The Albrecht ratios are very strict.
I think the other might be more related to whether you're having competition at binding sites for needed nutrients. And that. So, yeah, I mean, typically,
if you look over at a saturation or something, that can give you somewhat of a clue.
Well, it gives you a clue. The question then is, what do you do with it? Right. What does it really mean?
If you look and you've got a sample that comes back with real high potassium levels, you look for your base saturation on your magnesium. Even if your magnesium is in the optimal level on the soil basis, but your ratio is down.
Yeah, I think what I'm little sensitive to is just the idea that you can sort of make, and you need this perfect refined balance, because every soil is different. And I think a lot of things have been sold that didn't need to be sold based on the Albrecht approach. And usually, unless you're way out of whack, the university approach has been to say sufficiency is what we're looking for, no magical ratios.
There was a good review on this 3 years ago in Journal of Soil Science, where they looked at all kinds of studies across the country and found there was really no evidence, or very, very little, that the balance approach, it was always less economical than a sufficiency approach. That's kind of what I go on. I think, again, it's the degree of that ratio. The ratio the antagonism, it's real, it can happen. But I think, like I said, at UVM, we work at that more at a higher extreme. Because we do have some soils that are really, really high in magnesium, but if you're adequate for K, are you going to add more? I don't think so. So to make that balance.
Yeah.
No, it's a good question. It's a tough one because there's several labs that go by that.
I just, I'm still trying to understand the whole philosophical side of Albrecht, why people are so, they're usually people who hold to that view are extremely zealous for that. And I'm not quite sure
I don't know.
why that is. Do you have any ideas?
I don't have any ideas. I have some opinions.
No, I mean about well, no, okay.
What's the difference in an opinion and an idea?
An opinion is you can't say anything in court.
Right, okay.
But the idea, I believe, is, sustainability, balance, integrity of a soil solution, so that they've used all these Missouri soils to come up with this, and they've gotten a response based on some studies.
It actually started in New Jersey.
New Jersey,
In the 20s or 30s was the very, very earliest work.
Yeah.
And I think those were on some really sandy, low CEC soils.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this whole soil solution, dilemma of what actually goes into soil solution, some people really take it to the extreme, think that they can, be right there with the plant root and the rhizosphere, and make a conclusion about that. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's a mystery to me, a lot of what plant responds. I think some of the worm activity in some of these soils is a huge factor.
What's that, Kevin?
Some of the biological activity in arthropods, in particular, can change the whole dynamic of what's available once it passes through the gut in the protozoa.
Yeah, just all the organic acids from the plant roots.
Yeah,
that's a whole world of science that we're just starting to
it's pretty amazing.
understand.
Yeah.
And so, 50 years from now, well, you'll still be here, Kevin. We may be talking about a whole different kind of soil test that looks at these things. 20 years.
They may have, worms that do so.
Could be. All right, we're getting off subject here. So just to wrap up a little bit, back to you guys that are farming here, not us talkers. Alfalfa grass. What's your major big crops?
Alfalfa grass and grass.
Okay, that's what I typically will see over here, and I used to see more of it in the Champlain Valley, but it seems like it's more and more just grass with feed up alfalfa. But back 15, 20 years ago when we first recognized this issue around potassium with dry cows and milk fever, there was a number of folks, I got in on it a little bit, of seeing if we could produce a low K forage, for that. And I know Jerry Cherney did a lot of work. F. Thomas looked at it over at Minor Institute. And it was really hard to drive it down. But, you could drive the soil test down, but the actual soil content, getting it down to less than 1% was near impossible. But the other thing we discovered is you don't see big yield reductions either. It's hard to see a yield response sometimes to potassium with grasses.
I wonder, I know that so you could have from a yield perspective, you might not lose yield, but the plant might have been stressed to get the potassium it needs. Have they looked at the fiber, any differences in fiber on those soils where they really pulled it down to see, okay, do we have any evidence that this plant had any other kind of distress? Did we lose any fiber digestibility? Did we drive up our other?
A lot of this work was done before we were looking at digestibility. I had a trial, again, about 20 years ago, looking at different manure rates in combination with nitrogen. But I could see how I back calculated the soil K levels from all these treatments. Actually, I'll show a little bit of that. We did compare, we did forage analysis on some of those cuttings, and there was never any difference in like ADF, NDF.
Okay.
We weren't measuring NDF-D in those days.
Of
course, we clearly had differences in protein because it was different nitrogen treatment or different nitrogen levels because of the manure. But it's a good question. It's a good question. So I didn't mean for all this to happen. I thought I had it. So one comment though, if we're at low, with grass management, one thing we know is this interaction. You're talking about K balance, but the effect of nitrogen on other elements as far as uptake, and therefore concentration in the grass. We know nitrogen can oftentimes increase uptake of magnesium. I think it's just a flow effect. You're increasing the growth of the grass, and therefore it's taking up things like actually potassium and magnesium, sodium, these cations, and might just mass flow move with the uptake. But with potassium, oftentimes what we'll see is an increase, but then if your soil K levels get low enough, it starts mining it, okay, because you're really increasing your yield of grass. And then over a 2 or 3 year period, you might see a drop in K because you're mining the soils, unless, if you're not supplementing K. After reading about that, I went back to this data from a study I did years ago, and it was kind of interesting. I was, again, trying to look at this luxury consumption effect of K uptake by grasses, because there is an interaction with nitrogen. I think you don't always see it unless you're feeding it nitrogen. So this is the same plot, but just 2 different years. And it was at the end of the year. This is the potassium content of and these were mixed grasses, mainly orchard grass, some timothy in there, and then a little bit of brome. It was a mixed grass stand, mainly orchard grass stuff. So this was the soil test levels at the end of these particular years from across all the treatments. And what I had in this study was fertilizing different nitrogen rates in combination with manure. So my high end was around 180 pounds of N per acre per year, split across the cuttings. And my no, I had a 0 nitrogen fertilizer. So, and the yield was far lower for the 0 N. But this is K level. So without adding the nitrogen, soil test really didn't have near the effect on K uptake as when I was adding the nitrogen. So it just kind of confirmed, that previous slide. So, you're, again, if we use critical K levels, it all depends on other variables like how much nitrogen you're applying, when you're cutting it, that sort of thing. So, and then we need to always be aware of this. You like that one? The dietary cation anion difference. So I'm not going to go into it. Again, didn't mean for this. I didn't check these slides. I pulled this from an old presentation. But we do know potassium in particular can really influence that time of the close-up diet in terms of increasing the risk of milk fever. Because if that DCAD is too high, it really reduces the movement of calcium out of the bone into the bloodstream that's going to support milk production, right? So generally you want this to be actually negative, this balance of cations to anions during that time of the cow's phase. Okay. And you know, if we look at our forages, sodium's always pretty low, fairly consistent but really low. Chloride and sulfur on the anion side of this, they can vary in forages, but they're relatively low in content. So it really is the potassium that drives this, because it can swing a lot, as we know, from less than 1% K up to 3.5. I've even seen it as high as 4%. Okay. So that is the factor here of why our forages can influence this so much. Does it matter? How do you guys manage your close-up diets? Probably feed an anion supplement, right, to offset this, or no? Or feed some corn silage. Corn silage usually is low K, so that can offset it. But you know, it's something we became aware of many, many years ago. I just threw it in here as another factor to always think about. But here's the flip side, because I was always focusing on this close-up diet, okay, with this risk due to high K. But we also know once those cows start milking, you really want a positive DCAD, right? Of about, what, 30 to 50 milliequivalents per 100 grams is the unit. But you want a positive DCAD. And I don't know, a lot of our farms are feeding more and more corn silage as their forage. So watching your K levels and your DCADs is pretty critical. And here's where maybe our haylage, high K haylage can contribute to that forage. It's a good source of K for this dietary cation difference. Okay. I'm going to skip through all this because I just want to mention a few things. So I'm getting off potassium, unless there's any other comments or thoughts on K. It's relatively cheap now, so Tom, would you say?
Well, I will, when I said at $400 a ton, it's 33 cents a pound.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it was 30.
Yeah.
33 cents.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had a little spreadsheet. It was a very simple one to get everybody to say what's your price, and it was calculated out, but you already had it calculated. Okay. I just wanted to end this with a little bit, and it comes back to a little bit what Mike was talking about, but we've been looking at different grasses. I know Dan's been looking at Italian ryegrass a lot and some other grasses. So I just want to share some data I've recently summarized, comparing meadow fescue with tall fescue and orchard grass. We had some other grasses in there like Festuloleum and perennial ryegrass, not Italian. Those didn't do so well. So, and I've shown some of this data at meetings for the past couple of years. Any of you use tall fescue in your mixes? Meadow fescue, are you familiar with it? Okay. So, and you heard Dan recommend for that flooded soil tall fescue. You're using tall fescue mixed with alfalfa?
Sometimes mixed with orchard grass and alfalfa, sometimes mixed with orchard grass and smooth row grass, because alfalfa seems to be
these
In the
days?
Connecticut River Valley, so.
Okay, all right. So I think the interest in tall fescue in New England started about 10 years ago, maybe 15, with work done. Cornell started looking at it. It's interesting, I moved here 25 years ago. I had done a lot of work with tall fescue in Kentucky, where it's mainly grown. And when I moved here, I thought, oh, I'm glad to get out of the fescue belt. There's lots of grasses here that do well. And now it's come back. But it really is in the same, it's closely related to ryegrass. It's in that same group of grasses, you know, from a botanical perspective. And so it's a bunch grass that can be cut. It's very tolerant to intensive cutting. And tolerant to intensive cutting. And I think one of the other benefits is it's a little more tolerant to heat compared to the other cool season grasses. So you'll get a little more yield in the summertime. So most of the yield studies done, like at Cornell, or we had this one trial, the tall fescue was our best yielder most times. Not every year, every location, but generally you're going to get about a ton more yield out of tall fescue than you will orchard grass or certainly meadow fescue. So tall fescue, I think there's been a lot of interest, a lot of farmers trying it. Not everybody likes it. There's some issues around it. Meadow fescue is related to tall, it's closely related to tall fescue, but it's more of a northern climate grass. It's not as heat tolerant. Actually, it's more cold tolerant. And there was a rediscovery of this grass about 15 years ago in Wisconsin. So it wasn't even on the radar until those came out, even though it's a Europe, you know, all these grasses are from Europe originally, Europe and the Mediterranean.
They never really stopped using meadow fescue in Europe, did they?
No, and that's right. So once there was interest in meadow fescue in the States, then companies like Berenberg brought over their materials that they'd already been using in Europe. So a lot of the meadow fescues you can buy today are, you know, European cultivars. Nothing wrong with them, but you know, where there's a couple of them that have been released from Wisconsin. So having said that, we did okay. This is not my work, but I just as an introduction, one of my interests in meadow fescue was the fact that it is higher quality. This was a study done in Wisconsin a few years ago, comparing 3 meadow fescue varieties to tall fescue and orchard grass. Now this was, I think it was a limited trial. It was only one variety of tall fescue and one of orchard. But this is the NDF digestibility that Mike talked about. This was 48-hour NDFD, because that's where a lot of the studies use 48-hour. But what this showed, on the average across cuttings, whether that was cuttings for haylage, 3 to 4 cuts a year, or they also simulated pasture where they were cutting shorter material 6 times a year. But generally, they'd find NDFD was running 4 percentage units higher than tall fescue or orchard grass. Generally across years and locations and across the season. So if we go by what Mike talked about, what was that, a half a pound of milk for every increase in a NDFD unit? That can make a pretty big difference in your feeding program if it holds up all the way through. So that's what sparked our interest, was to look at this, was, is this a potential grass for quality? Okay. And so I've just got a little bit of, this is some graphs I generated from some studies we did here in Vermont. I had a trial with Heather Darby. We did a 3-year study. And we looked at 5 varieties of orchard grass, five varieties each of orchard grass, tall fescue, meadow fescue, festulolium, and perennial ryegrass. The festulolium died out after the first winter. The perennial ryegrass petered out after 2 years. So really it left these 3. And this is a graph just from the last year of the trial, 2014, looking at changes in, this is the lower solid line is just India, over by cutting and through the season. So spring cutting, summer, late summer. And then the dashed lines are NDF-D, and that's expressed as percent of the NDF. Okay. So if we look at that graph, the green line is meadow fescue, and this is the average of the 5 varieties. Okay, and the red line is tall fescue, and the blue line is orchard grass. So what stands out to anybody about any of this, not just the meadow fescue here? What we
So you've got different.
So what we did, just so we know, we have these
2-week harvest interval in there?
Well, yes, a week to 10 days between. So we tried to collect when the grass was about 10 inches tall. Part of it was to simulate what it might be at kind of a pasture level, but also just to have a starting point.
But they were all done the same day? Yeah.
No. Well, if you look, this is the date here.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry it's not more. Actually, I don't know what happened to them. I had some grids here, so it's a little easier to see.
One of the challenges is that somebody, one species is earlier maturing than other species.
Okay, so that's what I'm saying. What do you see here? That's
a
the,
huge problem.
that's,
Right.
so when we talk about meadow fescue being a high quality, well, is it high quality or is it just mature a little later? Okay, if you look at the first cut, then I'd say it matures later. Because then it did. I mean, it didn't start sending up a seed head until about a week later compared to the tall fescue. Now, orchard grass, we had 5 varieties, and 4 of them were pretty similar, and then 1 was a really late one. Because that grass you can have heading dates 2 to 3 weeks apart, depending on the variety. Tall fescue, my experience with tall fescue is it's more consistent. And the meadow fescue, they were all fairly consistent in this trial as far as when they were all maturing. But the meadow fescue was about a week later. So actually in this year, we tried to sample based more on when it was ready. But that gives you a little window of time maybe. But the change in quality was really not much different, okay? But it was generally higher in NDF-D compared to tall fescue and orchard grass, all right? And so generally we'll say try to harvest at about 50% NDF, and if we did that, then certainly the second cutting, I think that's where the meadow fescue looked better for digestibility. And the third cutting, actually orchard grass looked pretty good. It was pretty similar to the meadow fescue in this trial. Now I've got 2 other years in another location, so it's not always consistent like this. The other thing is, at least in this study, a lot of times I've seen data from Wisconsin where by the time you get to the August cut, this would be a lot lower. And we were still getting the quality here, at least in 2014. This is protein and the non-fiber carbohydrate. Now, keep in mind, the way we collect our forage, we put them in a dryer, grind them to run our analysis. So this hasn't been ensiled or made into hay like you would normally make hay. So this this NFC is reflecting that.
Dry.
It would be more like dry head, but artificially dry. You know, we're cutting, and because we want to get that into a dryer. So this is really capturing what's as close as we could, what's in the field.
So it's not sitting in the dark.
Yeah.
The dark windrow, it's not respiring much.
Right. So I'm more interested in the relative differences of the grasses here, not the absolute. Even though these numbers fit into what's typically range of grasses, I think, for NFC. But anyway, typical decline in protein, you know, as we delay our harvest. The first cutting, I think, is more extreme than the second one. But the NFC was interesting to me. By the August cut, it was far lower for all the grasses. So, and that doesn't surprise me. And it's hotter, so you're probably not getting the sugar buildup like you would in the spring cutting. So again, time of year and cutting is going to have a big impact on that potential quality.
So even though you may get a ton more for tall fescue, you may want to consider meadow fescue.
Well, you know, the debate with meadow fescue is that yield drag. I mean, it doesn't yield, it usually yields maybe 80% of what you might get from.
You didn't take a fourth harvest?
I didn't in that year, no.
Did you turn cows out on?
No, these are small plots.
And the reason I asked the question is because of the grazing situation. You turn cows out and they turn their nose up at tall fescue.
Yeah.
And I wondered if they would do the same thing. Supposedly.
I don't know. I don't think so, Tom. In fact, you know, I've been out on farms where we're looking, and this was before I became familiar with meadow fescue. I've seen cases where it looked like cows were grazing tall fescue. Now I'm convinced that it was meadow. And we did some surveys this summer. I had a student working for me that surveyed about, I don't know, 20 to 25 pasture farms. Just surveying what was out there botanically, and we found more meadow fescue than I thought. And these were, I said, when you go on a farm, try to get a field that at least that farmer has not seeded in 20 plus years, because you know there may be some newer seed mixes that have meadow fescue in it. But I think it's, you know, I went to the so this grass was introduced in New England back in the 1820s and was commonly used maybe for a while, but it, you know, other grasses did better. Timothy far outperformed it, I think, in those days.
Well, especially for their hay systems, you know.
Yeah, but it ended up out in Wisconsin, and that Driftless Valley area is where it's been rediscovered. But the whole, I mean, if you go back to seed sales, it all died in the 30s, 1930s. Once tall fescue got on the market, meadow fescue just plummeted. I never talked about, I never studied or learned about meadow fescue, hardly. There was an old Forage ID guide from the 50s that had meadow fescue in there, and that was my little bit of knowledge of this grass. Anyway, it was here. And if I go to the UVM herbarium and pull out samples, I find them from the 1860s, 1870s of meadow fescue. So it's more remnants than I thought. And I think it is more palatable. You know, the research has supported that. And I think, if you have a pasture field where it looks like tall fescue and they're grazing it, it might just be meadow fescue.
Two differences I noticed with it, though, I think this is more of the hypothesis level, is that it seemed to me that the fiber level across the whole season with tall fescue is more stable because it can take it's generally better at taking that hot weather. So more stable than the meadow fescue. And the other thing was, I've seen a fair amount of leaf spot in the meadow fescue.
Well, according to the literature, one reason it went out of favor back in the
Because of leaf spot.
diseases, just
Right.
leaf diseases.
Yeah. And interestingly, David Combs the other day, we had him talk at the St. Johnsbury location. He's from the University of Wisconsin, and He was talking favorably about grazing lactating dairy cows on some of the modern tall fescue varieties. And what he was saying was that typically we're used to how they graze down Kentucky bluegrass, orchard grass, taking it right down. They don't graze the tall fescue down as much, which in some ways maybe is a good thing for light interception. So I've seen it selectively grazed in plots just like Tom was asking about, where you have tall fescue, perennial ryegrass, orchard grass. You put the steers or heifers in there, and they'll eat everything down and they'll lay down on the tall fescue.
Right.
So if they have a choice, they're certainly going to eat other things.
Yes.
But I don't know. I kind of think we should try grazing some of this on Tom's farm.
No, and I was gonna, you know, Mike, I've seen, I think your point, and I was, you know, gonna say that I've seen, you know, it's an animal behavior thing and a learned behavior. I mean, I lived in Kentucky, you know, animals raised tall fescue.
Yeah.
So it's a learned, in fact, I remember years ago, Shelburne Farm used to, you know, before they set up their grazing program, it was all confined feeding, and they hired a fellow that came on that was all excited about rotational grazing, and they had always grazed their dry cows in some of their pasture fields, but now they set up, you know, so they set up in these former alfalfa grass fields, and they turned the cows out there. I mean, these cows ate alfalfa all the time. Alfalfa haylage, alfalfa hay. They went out in that field and they ate every weed in the fence row and then started bellowing. They did not want to touch that alfalfa. As an right,
Well, and
right.
And familiarity. They didn't.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think when our dairy farmers plant a seed mix that has tall fescue in it, those cows aren't used to it, and they will selectively graze everything else around it. I still say that's a problem for that dairy farm, so it's still an issue. I mean, most of this work is around haylage management. Right. You know, because your point's well taken.
On paper, tall fescue is great, you know, if you're harvesting it on time. But like cows, what matters, you know.
Yeah, and I certainly, it's another option. I think where the meadow fescue might, again, fit is in a mixture. Let's say an alfalfa or a red clover or grass mixture. Because of the yield drag or the lower yield, at least maybe you can compensate with that legume. So anyway, I just wanted to share that, and I just pulled out a little bit of some data. So these are my last two slides. These are the varieties we looked at of meadow fescue and orchard grass and tall fescue. So this was not a yield trial per se, but when we started this study, we contacted most of the major seed companies and just said, send us or recommend what you think is your best, that you're recommending in our region for, you know, for yield and quality of these grasses. So that's how we got these. And I would say in most cases, we didn't find variety differences in any of these quality parameters. I have not seen that. Little difference in yield sometimes, but not consistent.
Maybe maturity.
Maturity for the orchard grass, yes.
I guess it looks like there's some.
This Athos is a later maturing orchard grass compared to the others. The one that was different of the meadow fescue though is Azov. Now that is a release from Wisconsin. Those two came from Wisconsin. Hidden Valley and Azov. Hidden Valley looks like generally, it doesn't show it in this particular, this is first cutting. Let's go to second cutting. But as a trend, it tends to show the highest adjustability across cuttings, the Hidden Valley, but the Azov tends to show the lowest. So I don't know what's going on there. So there's a little variety difference. But overall, I think my take home for that is, you know, talk to your seed rep really well and who they buy their seed from, because the companies are really driving this. But I think there's opportunities for really boosting this quality, both with species, variety, and certainly management. I like Mike's comment though about he wouldn't want to take the chance of waiting 3 days to get that optimum time. So, Oh, you mentioned the disease. This is just from one. We did some visual ratings in our plots, and this was, I need to go back and look at the other times, but we did generally find, this is a low number would mean very little disease, and it was rating from 0 up to 5. It's just a rating score that I gave. And the meadow fescues, some of the varieties did show more disease than others. Tall fescue was consistently low. In this particular time, orchard grass was really low. Perennial ryegrass was terrible in my plots.
Looks like there's one variety though that had some.
That was low in that particular rating, yeah, that particular day. So there is variation, but I'd say as a whole, the meadow fescue is a little more susceptible. Even though Mike Kassler from Wisconsin said he has not experienced that.
We probably have higher humidity on average than they do.
Yeah.
I bet. That's a
Yeah.
big part.
So that's my thought.